First of all, welcome to The Circle, Upspring's monthly discussion series on the shifts, trends, and strategies shaping the architecture and design industry. For today's topic, New York doesn't just follow design trends, it creates them. We're joined by Upspring's very own co-founder and CEO, Tiffany Rafi, who will be introducing our other panelists in just a moment. A few housekeeping notes. We do have the Q&A function on, so please submit any questions that you have for the panelists during the conversation. We'll reserve 10 to 15 minutes at the very end to go through those, so please don't be shy. Send those over. And yeah, that's it for now. Over to you, Tiff.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brittany. Well, we're really excited to have you all with us today and for us to kick in on this conversation. The session theme today, as you all know, is Welcome to New York. New York doesn't just follow design trends, it creates them. So for more than a century, New York has shaped the global design conversation. But today, the city is evolving in ways that go far beyond aesthetics. Changes in development, public life, culture, and the way people interact with cities are fundamentally reshaping what it means to design in and for New York. And the city is still one of the most influential and competitive creative ecosystems in the world. The firms and the brands that succeed here tend to be the ones defining broader conversations around experience, community, wellness, and how people want to live and work. So today, we're digging into the architecture, public space, workplace design, and cultural identity that are evolving together, and what that signals for the future of design more broadly. At the end, we will have a Q&A, and we will absolutely want to get to all of your questions. So as Brittany mentioned, please feel free to drop them in the chat for us as we go. I don't want to delay any further, and I'd love to introduce our panelists. Eran Chen, founder and executive director of ODA, is with us today. Eran leads ODA's internationally recognized architecture and urban design practice, focused on socially engaged urbanism and the idea that architecture can shape human connection and collective life. We also have with us Ricardo Nabholz, the managing associate and studio creative director at TPG Architecture. Ricardo brings more than 20 years of experience designing workplace and commercial environments across finance, technology, media, and hospitality sectors. And then finally, Ryan Swanson, founder and principal of The Urban Conga. Ryan leads a multidisciplinary design studio exploring how play, participation, and community engagement can transform public spaces and urban experience. Thank you all for being here with me today. We're so excited to have you.
Yeah, thanks for
Thank you for having us.
Of course. Well, I'd love to dive in. I think we're all ready to rock. So I'd love to start off with why New York still matters. New York has influenced global design culture for generations, but the city is also changing rapidly. What do you think New York understands about the future of design that other markets still have not caught up to?
Well, maybe I should start, Tiffany. Good to be here. Thank you for having me. What great topic for all of us to dive into. And I think what does New York understand is a wonderful question. So I think New York understands that density and contradiction and friction creates creativity and innovation. And that New York succeeds because of it, because of the forces that are contradicting, that kind of have constant friction between one another. If you think of other modern cities, generally speaking, LA or Miami or many others, they were in some degree compartmentalized. So living and working and, enjoying and culture all are built in different hubs, and people are used to communicate with cars, transport with cars from one to another. Where New York City forces you to work through it all, through the mess and the friction, and it creates sort of a collision between maybe different cultures and different lifestyles and different industries. And that collision constantly bubbles and creates positive ideas, positive urge to solve issues of interactions and lifestyle and quality of life. And I think that's where New York City continuously succeed over many other cities.
Yeah, and I was going to jump in off of that, off of what Ron's saying. I think it also translates into the design world where it kind of provokes that kind of cross collaboration. Like even just look at this panel, you know, kind of different varieties of scale and work. And I feel like New York kind of allows for that to happen, you know, and kind of looking at how designers with different backgrounds and abilities, kind of looking at different scales, can kind of cross collaborate and create this special space that we're living within. And I think that kind of just that kind of natural element of being around different people and being kind of forced to be in that friction, you know, allows for that to also happen in that design space as well.
Yeah. And I think an iconic thing about New York that is relevant to this is the hustle, right? The idea that, you know, you can't approach problems with a preconceived idea of how to solve them, right? This is a city that thrives on agility, creative problem solving, design thinking. Our clients expect us to come to the table with an open mind and collaborative attitude, right?
Yeah, it's never static. It's always
Yeah, yeah.
shifting.
And I think to add to this is it is, I think it has this shining moment right now because as I think we'll continue to discuss today, we as density grows, but technology starts to kind of control many aspects of our life, human friction and, you know, just positive physical interactions are at the core of what everybody desires. And so New York City allows that where other cities try to strive for it. And I think in that sense, it is a very successful laboratory to how the physical attributes of city that allows for these human interactions flourish in a time where, you know, technology takes over.
I love that. I think that describing New York as a laboratory is a really perfect way to sort of set that forward. There's also just so much variety. So the pressure test is meaningful in that way. Eran, you've described architecture as social technology. How does New York's density and diversity continue to make it a testing ground for new ideas around how people live, interact, and experience cities overall?
Yeah, I think it's a funny thing because when we think about technology, I think we think of gadgets and screens and what buzz in your pocket or glow on your screen. And I keep on saying architecture is one of the original technologies we ever created because it organizes us, it orchestrates our behavior in a way, it shapes and programs us. And I like to say that architecture is a social technology because that's exactly what it does. And the same way that new technologies today are shaping our connectivity in our life digitally, architecture design consistently shapes our life physically. And I think technology have brought us to a point where we are recognizing the importance of the physical interface. So building, in a way, they determine the way we interact with each other. And so you can think about it as if architecture is a social technology, then every building is a script. And we can choose to write code for isolation, or we can choose to write code for connection. And of course, we try to do the latter. And so in that sense, there's a shift, I think, from architecture being concentrated on objects to architecture concentrated on human experiences. And so I'd like to call it form follows experience, where I think increasingly I believe that both the forms of our buildings, our neighborhoods, our communities should be shaped by the type of activation and interactions that they provide. And this technology that we collectively are kind of putting together reinforces the idea of physical connectivity.
Ryan, Ricardo, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. I think, yeah, it's an interesting time because I think this technology is kind of somewhat sometimes about efficiency. And I think sometimes when our cities are designed too much about efficiency, we lose that touch that everyone's talking about of personal connection. And so it's about how do we kind of focus less on the point A to point B kind of inner experience and start to think about kind of that what's happening in between and kind of start to, think about how our cities are developed to evoke this sense of wonder, evoke this sense of discovery, this exploration rather than this sense of I have to go here, do this, and then leave and go back and do this. And it just becomes this routine, this kind of monotonous routine in certain ways. So yeah, it's an interesting time, I think, for the way our cities are being shaped. And I think it's kind of sometimes drawing back away from that efficiency level and thinking about how we can allow it to be more explorative in certain ways.
I absolutely agree. I also think that it's efficiency, but also kind of functionality. And we've been all trained on the idea that form follows function. And again, our life today with technology means that we can do anything from anywhere. We can, work from home. We can consume entertainment and education from wherever. We can travel and leisure and at the same time consume culture. And so the built environment should start concentrating more on the human experience. What do we experience when we do these things, and less on how those things function per se.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, Ryan, I'm going to kick it back to you. What do you think many cities or developers still get wrong about designing public spaces people actually want to engage with?
Yeah, I think we're touching on it a bit through this conversation of, I think we're, as sometimes developers and designers of these spaces, we're trying to take too much control. We're not giving enough ability for the people to make the space their own and really kind of have that adaptability to it. We try to control too much within our design and the flow of the space rather than creating systems that allow for that adaptability to exist. And, we think about our cities as these kind of living organisms that are always kind of shifting and changing and adapting. We have to kind of think about that more in the way our spaces are designed. And I think that makes people feel more comfortable in that space when I can take control of it and feel that ownership around this space that I'm navigating. And yeah, and just again, going back to that kind of, how are we kind of thinking about these in-between spaces? How are we thinking about, what happens when I sit and wait for the bus? What's happening in these kind of moments of my day, and not just these kind of destinations that I'm trying to arrive to. And I think that goes back to what Aaron's saying in the sense of creating that human experience of how do I then force to connect with my neighbor and not just navigate next to them. And how do we create those moments to exist? I think is something that I think we're still striving for, and I think it doesn't fully exist. I think it in terms of the way we're designing, I think it naturally exists, but how do we kind of create maybe the opportunities for that to exist more regularly in our spaces? Yeah.
I was just thinking as you spoke about Elizabeth Park. I don't know if you guys know Elizabeth Park on Elizabeth Street, the Lower East Side. It was never designed as a park. In fact, it's an empty lot that was never built. And I guess the failure to build that lot has created the connection between Elizabeth Street and I think what's the next street over? I can't remember, but it's a walk-through void right in the density of the Lower East Side. And naturally, it became this place where people just want to hang out. The landscape have grown almost wildly. Sculptures and artists have created work of art. And when you walk through this, it really reinforces the in-between spaces you discussed and how we inhabit the voids in a way that is unpredictable. And that's the beauty of cities, right? These unpredictable moments of interactions that are intimate, but at the same time are public. So that's one great example, which I don't think it was never designed as such, and it became such a desirable place of community.
And sadly, they're trying to develop it, and recently people fought
Right.
back to make that
Exactly.
stop. So it shows the shift in
Resenting it.
mindset, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
I love that park. It's between Elizabeth and Prince.
Yes.
But yeah, it is definitely a great example of, you said it perfectly, really sort of filling the void, right? And it's hard to find that balance because I can imagine there's so much fear in providing that space because you don't want it to go in a direction that maybe isn't good or positive, right? And so I would assume that's a really hard balance to strike. So I could definitely appreciate that. Ricardo, I'd love to sort of hear from you what role commercial spaces need to play today, and what do they need to do now that they didn't need to do a decade ago?
Certainly. Yeah, so as we talk about navigating the city and experiencing the city, walking among all of these buildings around us, I think, we have to remember there's millions of people stuck inside these buildings all day, right? And that's a big part of their experience of the city is, existing inside of a building. And 10 years ago, I think Aaron said that architecture shapes our lives physically. 10 years ago, inhabitants of these spaces really had no agency in how that experience affected them, right? It's like you came to the office under obligation. Um, Now, as I think as we're seeing a trend in this conversation right now, right? It's about co-creating spaces and creating spaces of meaning. And so that's something commercial spaces need to do that they're really not very good at, right? They're still not very good at that. But it is incredibly important for people to feel like they belong in a space, like the space has a purpose in their life. And it's something that landlords and tenants who are moving into these spaces with hundreds of their employees are starting to grapple with. So it's become a big part of our practice, kind of figuring out how to help them navigate this new landscape.
Ryan, Aaron, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, yeah, I was going to jump in. I think it's always interesting with commercial space because, if you think about it, like with the digital age, like a lot of commercial spaces are dying in terms of like people coming, like you said, going to the office, like those things, there's no need to necessarily do that because I could sit on my computer. So now it's seeing the shift of these commercial spaces often becoming about experiences and how do we
Yeah.
create these experiences to get people again physically connecting because we're craving that. I think we saw that big shift happen after the pandemic where everybody lost and was pulled away from them. And it was like, everything needs to be an experience. Everything needs to be, engaged. And I feel like that like trend of excitement around that has slowly faded as we've gotten back to whatever norm that is. But these spaces have still felt the results of that.
Mhm.
And I think you're seeing these kind of shifts of like, it's always interesting to us because we work in a lot of these spaces that, whether it's a commercial space or a pop space, a privately operated public space, like how are these kind of spaces starting to kind of translate and to these kind of ways of getting people connecting and experiential and really exploring what that looks like as a sense these in-between spaces that we're talking about and serving as that purpose in different ways. Sometimes a little more static and a little more kind of stale than others, but I think they're trying in ways of how do you introduce brands and things into those elements. But yeah.
I think it's also a matter of choice, and we are as a society we're increasingly facing choices that in the past maybe we didn't have. Do you choose to work from home or do you choose to come to the office? Although that's not across the board, of course, many places are requiring you to come to the office. But do we work? Do we want to go out on a Saturday morning, or do we want to connect digitally to whatever, a movie? And those choices are starting to shape those, the physical environment. I can give an example that we just completed a building in Buenos Aires called Ola Palermo. And it used to be an old parking garage, a huge parking garage that was neglected for many years. It was just across from the Palermo Park in a place where you couldn't figure out what to do in because it wasn't a place for office. It wasn't a residential area. It wasn't a commercial area. And we were invited to kind of rethink what can be done with this. And what eventually we proposed to do is to maintain the existing building, which is the most sustainable thing you can do, but carve into it and extend the park to the roof of the structure. And so the building becomes a public loop that allow people to go up to the roof of the building, experience the view of the city, and continue down as part of their everyday life. And I remember the client asked us, well, yeah, but what's going to be the program? What am I doing inside the space? I says, don't even worry about this. Because once the park is going to be there and everybody want to experience it, then the choice, companies would choose to be there. And in fact, it became the most attractive and the most expensive, by the way, office space in Buenos Aires, competing with all of the mega towers that exist in downtown, a place of education, Columbia University, artists go there, restaurants have opened, we have an amazing sculptural garden. And so what drives now the functionality and the success of the building is not its original program, it's rather the type of experience that it provides.
That's a perfect example of what I was going to chime in on. I think that sort of that post-COVID environment, Ryan, to your point also, it was really focused on generating an experience, right? In a way that created something that you wanted to specifically interact with and was meant to be experienced in a certain way that you were being drawn to. Whereas I feel as time has moved on, and as you said, we've moved closer to whatever normal we're living now, which doesn't feel normal at all, but it's all good, is again moments just like you've described, right? Creating environments that provide an experience in a way that people would have never called an experience before, right? Just the opportunity to move through life and be sort of touched by something along the way. I think that's, again, a really great example. Ryan, I'd love to chat about community-led design a bit. I know it's central to your practice. What do designers and developers often misunderstand about creating spaces that genuinely foster connection and participation?
Yeah, I think, coming from an architecture background, and I think often as designers, we see opening that door to community-led design as a hurdle. Often it's a checking of a box. It feels daunting to open the door, to check your ego as a designer and say, I'm going to allow people to critique what I'm doing and create this kind of cohesive moment. And for us, it's, I think we're missing the point sometimes as designers, as this is the most valuable tool in creating these spaces, is really letting the community shape what they want in these spaces and how they're going to use this space. And I think that, for us is the biggest thing in creating kind of ownership and that stewardship that will last through a project. I think, like Aron talked about his project as reference, like that doesn't just, that comes from understanding about what's existing in that space for that programming and that natural ability for people to start making the space theirs. We know, yeah, sure, we're as designers, we have those tools to create those moments, but we don't really know until we open that door and kind of hear the stories and let the people drive what they want to see in those spaces. And so I think it's often missed in that. I think it, like, what we find is it feels very much like, oh, we had to do this, so we did it. And it's not about we need to do this to make it a vital project. And so as a part of our practice, it's very critical to have that throughout the entire design process into that kind of programming and how is the space being used afterwards, not just thinking about it, oh, we did a couple workshops in the beginning and now here's the design. We let them choose the color of the building, or we let them kind of choose this one component of that, but it's really about designing and shaping whatever space it is, scale, work that we're doing as a kind of continuous process throughout the entire project. And I think that just shows in terms of how a space is utilized. And you can see that in terms of like what the after effects are, in terms of like a space that is often sitting dead and not used probably didn't have any engagement because they didn't know how people were going to use that space or wanted to use that space prior to building it. So, when you kind of doing this process, it's kind of almost a guarantee. What we find often people say, oh, how do you know that people are going to use the work that you're creating? It's like, well, we took 8 months of engagement to get to that point. Like that, it was all fueled from those conversations. Of course it's going to work. Like because we were told that this would work in that space and what people wanted. And then designing in that adaptability through time, allowing people to come in and make it their own as well and tell their own stories in that space. And it's not just that singular kind of story in which the space is created. But yeah, I think it's often missed, we find, especially the larger, I think often we hear, oh, well, you're working in the smaller scale, it's easier to do that. And I think that's false. I think it's, as the projects expand and get larger, it's more critical to kind of work that closely and have the community kind of lead that narrative of what our public spaces will be shaped and designed. Yeah.
And Ryan is a true champion of community engagement. It takes a lot. It takes a village. It takes patience and interactions, and it's where I think designers and architects become more than just the traditional architectural role. They become activators and um, influencers on a community level. One thing I can think of is the project we've done in Brooklyn years ago called Denizen. And it's a residential complex, about 1,200 apartment units, but there was a huge resentment by the local community in the neighborhood to the developer coming in and building it. And so we opened a non-for-profit organization called Open that was supposed to go into those community groups and try to ask them, what would you want to see here and how you could interact. And we ended up understanding there's a huge kind of culture of murals and artists and combination of artists and kids. And we created this program where the artists have painted 14 mega murals on and around the building, which, by the way, was an incredible project, but became hugely beneficial for the developer at the end, not only for the community, because it became the trademark of the projects. The project was more embraced by people who live there. The park, which is public park at the center of it, now became part of the turf of the local communities because they've done this. They've created those art pieces. I think it's a challenge. It's an ongoing challenging thing. To what degree you share, design efforts with the community, and that's why I said I think Ryan is a champion. But we all need to strive to do more of this.
Yeah, and I think, it is definitely daunting. I think that's always the scary thing, especially like you're opening the door to hundreds and thousands of people to criticize and bring their thoughts, and often people, you can't please everyone, and it is. But I think it's often how the thing that we think we have to reevaluate as designers is how we're setting those systems up in ways what we're engaging, because I think it's often the way you see it is there's a microphone in the room. The loudest voices are the ones that are heard, and of course those are the ones that are the most extreme, where there's this kind of layer of all these people in the back that don't have a chance to bring their voice. And so that's where, for us as a studio, we see like play methodologies that we do within our work also work as a part of that process. Like, how do we create a giant block party where people are coming out and engaging in a space and giving their feedback, or how do we kind of create opportunities for people to start building and creating their own things in that space together and develop that through time. And for us, that's been a really great model of like, how do you start to reevaluate how we're doing these workshops? Because I think that's what also sometimes scares people. It's like, oh, we got to do another one where I stand up there and people just yell at me. And it's like, sure, you got to give the space for people to yell at you. It's going to happen in the spaces. People are going to have, there's bigger problems sometimes beyond even the project that we're doing, and you have to leave space for that. But I think it's about how we are shaping that kind of process as designers that needs to sometimes be evaluated to make it less scary, I think, for everyone, in that space, and make it more opening and more safe for people to feel like they can engage in those spaces. Because I think often people don't feel comfortable going into those spaces and giving their feedback until, like you said, until afterwards. Sometimes you'll do these engagements and no one shows up, and it's like, because people don't feel safe in those spaces. And then all of a sudden you hear, oh, I hate this design or this. And it's like, well, why weren't you there in that process? And people say, I didn't feel welcome there. I didn't feel safe there, in these kind of more static environments. So what we find is often like meeting the people where they're at. Like, how do we go there? How do we start engaging at that ground level and then work up to that? But yeah, it's definitely, I think, daunting, and especially as designers, I think we also as designers have to check our egos, because again, we think we know all. I think, especially in that kind of Bauhaus architecture way of thinking, and so it's how do we kind of pull back from that? And I think you're seeing more of that nowadays, I think, with larger studios and everybody kind of looking at that as a valuable asset, but still a big shift that needs to start to happen.
Yeah, I would love to see play like you described with these kinds of activities come into the discovery process that we use in commercial projects, right? Because, like you said, it's really important for people to feel like they can be heard and that their voices matter. And we have a bunch of methodologies that we use to get data out of people so that they can feel like they're a part of a process, but none of them are very playful, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think having people have that opportunity to connect with the project,
Mm,
again, it shows in
mm,
that long-term
yeah.
usage, and that stewardship of it and that care of it. Like, we often work in spaces where people are saying, "Oh, this project's going to get destroyed within a week," and it's like, yeah, well, that happened because there was no connection to that project that was built there. It's
Mhm.
like, if people have that connection, they have that ownership around it, they have that care for it, and yeah, play is such a valuable tool in creating that. I think we often think of play just as this association to a specific space, for kids and its playgrounds, and this is where play happens. But if we think about it as a methodology and kind of how do we kind of layer that into that, it's really special in terms of like creating that empathy, creating that safe
Mhm.
space for people to connect.
Aaron, I would love to sort of hear how you're seeing the relationship between real estate development and public or social space evolve specifically. Do you think developers today are genuinely prioritizing community and social interaction, or are they still really treating them as amenities or auxiliary?
Now, the reason I smile is because there's constant perception that there's a conflict between the two. That, what's good to the community or the people is not good for the developer and vice versa. And we've been working with the private sector for years and years. And I've decided many years ago that I'm going to stop blaming the developers and I'm going to start blaming myself. Because, smart real estate developers are looking to understand cultural shifts and trends in order to have an edge. And the days of built it and they'll come are over. I mean, there are, and I'm sure that they might come back, days where it doesn't matter what you build, people are just going to flock into your product. And New York City have seen a good share of that. But that's definitely not where we live today. And I think our role as architects and designers is to guide them through this process and understand that community, or the sense of community, is evolving from kind of a marketing amenity into a sort of economic and cultural driver. And there's a real shift. It's a real shift when spaces that are communal spaces stop being kind of an amenity for a building to kind of look good, but they become an infrastructure. They are the foundations of how every project should be built. And that density by itself is just not going to be enough. It's not going to play the trick. You can't just densify sites and hope they will be urbanistically successful or commercially successful. And so our narrative, at least to our clients, is, look, we understand what you need. You need a successful project that's going to thrive. And here's what's happening today. What's happening today with culture is that people are looking to be part of authentic infrastructure that allows them to be connected to themselves, to their community, to the outdoor spaces, etc. And if we're not going to narrate that as part of the foundations of any project, then you're missing the boat. You're losing it. You're leaving money on the table. So I always take the responsibility back to us. I think that it's a tendency of our profession to blame the clients for stuff like that, but I think it's all in the way that we articulate it and we explain it. And I think what we see is more and more real estate developers, not only in New York, around the world, are understanding that they don't understand how to do it and what's the right way to do it, and because there's not enough good examples. But they understand that if you build a narrative that is surrounding the fundamentals of interaction, there's a way to be more successful.
Ryan, Ricardo, anything you'd like to add?
I mean, yeah, I would just agree on that. I think, we're seeing that from our end of like being brought into these projects to create and shape some of those kind of smaller experiences as a part of bigger developments. And I think that's been a shift as of lately, that we've seen more developers taking that interest. So not just working with municipal agencies to create these spaces at a smaller scale, but working as a part of these larger developers kind of, yeah. And I think that it translates from the architects and people that are building and working with these developers. Obviously, I mean, maybe sometimes it's the developer, which is great, but it's like, I think this kind of conversation that happens to say, hey, we need to kind of look at how these experiences are existing beyond just the larger kind of building and what happens in that open spaces in between. And so we've definitely seen that shift, I think, in the past few years of like that kind of bigger focus being brought into those projects.
Yeah, in the commercial spaces as well. I think, and the trend is enduring because it is profitable, right? I think clients are seeing that when they engage people meaningfully and create meaningful spaces for them, that they're more likely to use them. This is not rocket science, right? But it is a new development in how we think about commercial spaces that they get higher utilization and people are happy to be there, right? They're happy to come in because they feel like their needs are being met and there is an authentic experience waiting for them wherever that might be.
And there's increasingly what's called POPs, privately owned public spaces. Privately owned public spaces is taking oneself's site or property, let's say a developer buy a piece of land, and saying, you know what, if we're going to dedicate a portion of that into a unique public interactions that expands the public realm in this particular area, right? Because I don't know, there's not enough green space, or maybe there's a missing plaza, or let's bring the people to a roof because they can see the city. Those POPs starts to prove to be extremely successful, because otherwise we rely on existing infrastructure that was designed for the city years and years ago, right? We have sidewalks, we have streets, we have some big parks, but as density grows, they're not enough. And so expanding the public realm through unique experiences in your private development, like an office building, for example, the idea that the office building has to be, this exclusive structure with a doorman and a huge lobby that is empty, and that's what brings tech young people or whatever to want to go to work. That is changing. And now you see more and more mega office buildings that have public spaces at their lobby and art installations and extended of parks, etc. So commercially, I see a major shift and change in some of those buildings as well.
Ricardo, in that vein, where do you think workplace and mixed use design is still lagging behind how people actually want to live and interact today?
I think it's lagging behind that there's still a lot of people that don't get it, right? That don't understand that the relationship of kind of authentic experience and successful project. I think that there are a lot of spaces, we see them every day in the city. Like you see a space that it's aesthetically, you can tell it's trying to do something, but it just feels kind of soulless. And there's still a lot of these kind of novelty spaces that are popping up, this misunderstanding that like an amenity is something that is desirable just because it's an amenity, right? Whatever that amenity might be, right? If there's not an understanding of the needs in that specific area for that specific amenity, then it's going to be a failure. So it's there are parallels, I think, in all three of our practices to this trend where if you build it with meaning, right? If you build it with intention and with community input, right, you're going to have a much more successful outcome, regardless of what sector you're working in or what kind of project you're building.
Aaron, we're seeing more overlap between architecture, hospitality, residential, and lifestyle design. How is that influencing the way mixed use and community-driven environments are being designed?
Human life is no longer, as I said before, compartmentalized, and building shouldn't be either. And essentially, the kind of the real shift is where people are no longer expecting from a building to just be single expressions of themselves. It's becoming dull and not inspirational. And so we hear more and more about mixed use projects. And I just want to kind of make sure we understand the phrase, because it's a phrase that is meant to say, what if we bring everything together? What if we take a hotel and an office building and a residential building and retail, and we're going to force them together into one structure? And the idea of it is great. I think the implementation is more important. Because what's important really is not just to pile them vertically, stack them with their own circulation and kind of solve density issues, but to really make sure that 1 + 1 = more than 2. And that the life that the building or the block or the neighborhood provides being mixed use is much richer and much more kind of diverse. And these elements relates to the level of activations of the public realm across different hours of the day. It's nice when, the cadence of movement in a building on a hotel is different than the resi, different than the office. And so you've kind of overlapped those over time. And then the ability to shape spaces that have this surprise interaction that is not planned. Because so much of our buildings is about what's planned to be done. This is a space for this is a space for that, there's a space for this. When we start blurring the line between these programs, we find that we have more and more unexpected way of interaction. So just a quick example, we've designed a building in Rotterdam called The Post, which is a mixed-use program converting an old post office building, which is an historical building in Rotterdam, adding a tower to it and bringing both residence and hotel and commercial and office and cultural elements together. And it was very interesting to see how the idea of generating human physical energy through a structure could be so much easier and so much more attractive where you put these elements together as opposed to kind of segregate them.
Ryan, Ricardo, any thoughts? No, sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
Oh no, I know we're short on time, so
yeah, no worries, totally fine. I just wanted to make sure I gave you the opening before I sort of plowed through. No, I think that is, and I see some questions sort of on the topic, so we'll dive in further. But I do think that is a huge challenge that I even see when I'm interacting with spaces in the city. It feels like every experience is sort of isolated to itself in some instances, rather than sort of feeling cohesive or intentional sort of as you progress through the space overall. So I think that is really helpful. And I think mixed use really sounds good because it's almost like if one thing doesn't work, maybe something else will, as opposed to using one alongside the others to really help make maximum impact.
Yeah, there's endless. I'm sorry, just
No, no,
there's clearly endless challenges in putting this together. You can imagine, especially when you go to vertical cities, you have to have separate circulation path and egress and other things like that. But I think the added benefit from these elements is much greater than the complexity and the headache that it creates to the design team or the developers or the construction team. If we smartly, unite these elements where one is not ambivalent to the other, but rather kind of reinforcing the other's activity. We see many buildings around the world that are actually shifting towards that vision.
As we all know, New York is one of the most competitive design markets in the world. Ricardo, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what separates firms and brands that shape the design conversation in New York from those that struggle to stay as relevant in it.
My mic here. So something I mentioned at the beginning of the talk is agility and the willingness to go there with your clients. Also, they expect us to be thought leaders. That's kind of a trite phrase, but that's an expectation that there is of your design professional. They're going to bring something to the table that you hadn't thought of before. And it's firms that lead with a point of view and know how to make it visible. I think, in New York, good work is necessary, but it's not always sufficient. There's an enormous amount of competition here, as you said, and the firms that shape the conversation are the ones that pair strong work with a clear point of view. firms that can articulate why design matters beyond taste, how it affects culture, performance, recruitment, retention, all those things that are important to commercial clients, and also ones that are, really visible in the market, right? It's important to participate in things like this, or participate in the industry and have you know, a vettable presence in the design industry, right? I think that, clients are looking for a bigger voice sometimes when they're working on a bigger project. Um, and I think, ones that stay relevant are ones with authorship that are not just producing projects, they're producing a point of view. I think I had just said the same thing twice, but you know what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
no,
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
From obviously our perspective,
Mhm.
since I'm sitting at a very different seat at the table
Yeah.
than you all, and mostly live my life in awe of what you are able to do and accomplish.
Mhm.
I find that even the most brilliant of designers, architects, creatives tend to lean on showing what they've done as
Mhm.
proof of what is possible. And I wish I could just record myself and put it in a Build-A-Bear and hand it out to people.
Yeah,
It's what
it's
you
a
haven't done
hard
yet.
it's a
Yeah.
hard paradigm to get from underneath, because they're from a lot of clients are looking for kind of that reassurance that you know how to do it, right?
Mhm.
And I think what they should be looking for is, um the ability to challenge any ideas that they might have, any preconceived ideas they might have of what the road to success is, and to offer them credible ideas that they might consider, that, perhaps were completely, uh, what am I trying to say? Like in conflict with their, uh, you know, with their original intentions. I think, curiosity is so important, in our industry as well, right? Like being able to, uh, apply a little bit of curiosity and common sense can solve a lot of problems.
Yeah, absolutely. You're mitigating a whole lot of risk, right?
Hmm.
On a day to day. And so the projects that have happened or what has been accomplished is
Hmm.
mitigates that risk. I totally get that. At the end of the day, the brands that we see evolve and grow and succeed, even in economic times that have hiccups in them, or whatever it might be, the challenges that our society is facing at any given time, are the ones who aren't afraid of owning their voice and authority on what is possible. And everyone keeps throwing around the words thought leadership, and it's hard, right? Because it's so vague. But at the end of the
Yeah.
day, regardless of whether or not there's an appetite for actually implementing the perspective or the thought or the innovation tomorrow, sharing that helps move things forward and maybe creates a 15 or 20% impact instead of the 100%, right? That's on the table.
Yeah.
So I think um, I'm answering the question myself now because I can't help myself. But I think at the end of the day, it's about being willing to own that point of view and that authority and that perspective, and not being so scared about mitigating that risk all the time.
Yeah.
But again,
And
I know such a
And I
balance.
think, our most successful projects right now are ones where clients are not afraid of the discovery process. I think, both Aaron and Ryan spoke earlier about engaging the community, and in a commercial project, that's engaging your stakeholders and your, the folks that work there. And, workplace used to be about density, and density was king, and benchmarking was so important. People wanted to know what their peers were doing. And, the most exciting projects we work on are ones where clients come to the table and they want to learn about themselves. They want us to help them learn about themselves and then build and create something together that is really, that only could only ever work for them and no one else.
Yeah, totally agree.
Well, I'm getting yelled at now, so I'm going to skip ahead and let Brittany sort of dive into some of the Q&A so that we can make sure we get to them.
Thanks, Tiff. I saw a few questions come through. So, first one is, what is the future for existing office buildings that have more vacancy after COVID, where people are now working more remotely?
Well, I could start. I mean, a lot have been said and talked about the wave of conversion of old office buildings. It's a double spear problem. One, there was, COVID that have shifted the vision from the you have to be in the office every day in order to be productive to something a bit more fluid. And technology, of course, have caught up with that and allowed people to work more from home and be more nimble. But at the same time, we have in many cities, or if you take New York as an example, you have more and more buildings. In fact, the fact is that more than 60% of the office buildings in New York are 60 years old and more. So think about waves of construction. And when a lot of these kind of big office buildings were built, 60 to 100 years have passed. And some of these buildings are simply dated. Either they are way too deep and they don't provide for natural light, the ceilings are low, or they're just not up to speed in terms of codes and sustainability. So you've got these two problems overlap to what have emerged as a major real estate problem, not only in New York City downtown, but DC and other cities like that. The good news is, like we said in the beginning, that forces innovation. And once the dust settled and people lost money in terms of the value of the building they thought that they have, new developers buy those buildings and much less money, and they have to make do. And that's where new ideas could come to play. I've seen many different ways to convert old buildings into something else, either residential buildings or mixed-use buildings. Some of these buildings have to be cut partially to allow more light and air and to make sure the floor plate is not as deep. Some of those facades are being replaced, but I think the value of maintaining this old infrastructure and trying to be creative about what we could do with them might force some of the topics we've discussed today. Unexpected programs on these buildings, maybe vertical parks, maybe markets, maybe public ground that is privately owned public ground that now expands the sidewalks where those buildings nest and create some excitement. So I'm very bullish and excited about this. It takes time. But I think in 20 years, we're going to look back and say, wow, I mean, this transition of the old infrastructure, old office building has actually been a blessing in disguise.
And there's actually a shortage of Class A office space in New York. That's something that's very interesting about this market is there's a much higher demand for high quality space, and that is creating, this invisible checkerboard of desirable and undesirable areas that if you just look at Manhattan, you're like, well, why would Third Avenue be worse than it's like it's just one avenue away? But if you're a Park Avenue address kind of organization, you can't go to Third Avenue, right? For whatever that internal metric is for you. And so yeah, I think there's a lot of value to be mined from these properties. Yeah.
And what I've learned, by the way, about conversions, because I think a lot of us are still maintaining the old state of mind because Class A, as you mentioned, Ricardo, is so desirable. How do we upgrade a building to a Class A office building? And we try to do the typical things. Oh, we need to have the high ceilings. We need to have the great lobby. We have to have the, sustainable facade. This is all good and well. But I think what I've learned in Buenos Aires in this project, for example, is if you don't compete with the existing Class A office buildings and try to rebuild something that you can't, why don't we think more creatively and provide to the market a new type of Class A office building that while it's not a curtain wall glass tower, it is a more socially community involved, engaging type of market that people would love to work in. And then we're going to create a new type of product that people would want to be associated with, not trying to compete with the old version and innovating a new type, a new version of it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's how we get people to move away from Park Avenue, right? Create something better yet unexpected.
Exactly.
Okay. Ryan, this question was for you specifically. Can you give an example of that adaptability, especially in public spaces? So this came up at the very beginning of the panel discussion.
Yeah, I think we always talk about it in designing kind of the sense of an open-ended space. So how do we kind of not have a space that's static or a thing that's static where people kind of engage with or go to and they've done it and been there, but how is it kind of ever changing and adapting over time? Like I think I always talk about like the urbanist William White talked about it well. It's like if you can move a chair with an inch within a space, you feel that ownership and adaptability of that space, which then drives you to kind of creating that space feels more of yours. So we always think about how is that whatever we're creating, you know, in a sense, allowing the person to take that ownership and it's open-ended enough for them to put their own identity onto it, whether it's, you know, an organic way of seating that you can sit and climb or slide on or jump on or use as a table or a chair. Like, how are we creating these spaces to be open-ended and not kind of static in the way that they're created in the space?
Amazing. And then the last question that came through with our final 2 minutes, what is your experience with change order to projects from a client? What is the best way to handle those once the full set is in for design?
That's a very practical question right there.
It is. Anyone want to volunteer an answer?
Yeah, I mean, look, change order is part of life that we all have to live with, and it's not a great one. And or value engineering, I think the question was value engineer or change order. I'm sorry.
Sorry, it was change order.
Change order. That we have as a profession, we've structured a fee structure with our clients that is holistic. We give a price to a project. I'm talking in most cases, and then we have to execute based on our price. But by nature, the changes that occur to projects as we work on the design, which might be a year and a half to process, are almost inevitable. And in most cases, they don't come from us. They either come from the client, the reality changes, budget changes, there's millions of others, which then by default puts us in an uncomfortable situation where we have to raise our hand and say, oh, wait, stop. It's not what I signed up for, and there's got to be a change order. This is a bad rap for us as an industry because it puts us in the seat of we have to kind of explain why are we doing it as opposed to a natural progression of any service that you give. So, it's hard to deal with it. Clients don't love it, but I think for our profession, we have to be very firm about the fact that we are, or our service, our talent, everything that we bring to the table is not infinite, and it's definitely not, shouldn't be underpriced. And when things change, we need to adapt. We need more time. We need more, fees. And it's something that designers and architects should not be shy away from.
Thank you. Does anyone have anything to add before we wrap up? Last words?
I just want to say thank you. Yeah, it was a pleasure speaking with
Thank
you
you.
all, Ron and Ricardo.
Yeah, likewise. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll be sending out the recording of today's session via email this afternoon, so keep an eye on your inbox, and you are welcome to share that with any of your team members who you feel will find it valuable. And then just a note, all of our previous The Circles are available on demand in our The Circle gallery on the We Are Upspring website. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Tiff, for moderating, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.